Even the parrot, said my nurse severely, knows better than to eat the peel. I might have retorted that in this matter man showed himself superior to the brutes, but I knew very well that she would only have told me not to be pert. Hello again and welcome to the Dorothy L. Sayers podcast. Today we are talking about a delightful work, Even the Parrot. It's one of Sayers' stabs at children's literature, and to be honest, it's a curious little piece of writing. Join us to see if you can make heads or tails of it. I'm your host, Lindsey, and let's get started. Okay, so in the last episode, I asked how many times I used the word distributist or distributist or something like that in Sayers, India, and I got a response back, and it was 7 times, and I think I actually said it 9 times, so that's a ridiculous amount of times to say that word. And also in response to the question, when it comes to Sayers, what country would you be interested in hearing more about, we had unanimous votes for Germany, which is great because Germany is actually the easiest one to do in relation to Sayers. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for your responses. Today, though, we're talking about kids' books, sort of. And I'm happy to say I have a guest joining me. I'd like to introduce you to Selah Hurd, a fellow Dorothy L. Sayers enthusiast. She's writing her senior thesis on Sayers' essay. What's the name of the essay, Selah?
The Faust legend and the idea of the devil.
Okay, so Sayers and the idea of the devil, and also Faust, and she's incorporating some other depictions of evil following Sayers' essay. But in fact, Selah is one of the most well-read people I have met when it comes to Sayers, and lots of other things. So I'm so glad to have her with me as we wrestle with Even the Parrot. So Selah, say hello to the listening audience.
Hello, audience.
If you had to come up with a few adjectives to describe Even the Parrot, what would you say?
Well, I think the first one that would come to mind would probably be strange. It's definitely bizarre, but I think it's also very witty, and it really makes you think because there's a lot of layers to what she's saying. And I also think it's funny.
Yeah, so many layers. I don't think I know how many layers are actually.
Yeah, I don't think I do either.
And it's funny, as you say. It's funny you mentioned strange because Ralph or Rafe Hone, in his literary biography of Sayers, he says...
Such a strange lady.
Well, yeah, okay, that's for Sayers as a whole. But the word he uses for Even the Parrot, and the 2 paragraphs he has on it, is strange. So it kind of strangeness continues. So I'm going to tell you guys what Even the Parrot is, and then Selah and I are going to talk about it because I'm just happy to pick her brain regarding Sayers. So Even the Parrot is a little tiny book published in 1944. Its full title is Even the Parrot: Exemplary Conversations for Enlightened Children. It consists of 5 short stories about the children, Matilda and Archibald, and their nurse, whose name is Nature, Nurse Nature. In each of the stories, the children learn something valuable from the animal kingdom, and it's worth reading to you the titles of each story to kind of give you an idea, give you a feel for the book. So there's the canary, or healthful slumbers, the cat, or family affections, the beehive, or the perfect society, the boa constrictor, or rules of diet, which is a particularly chilling one, I think.
Agreed.
The rabbit, or town planning. And some further context, in a letter to C.S. Lewis, Sayers calls Even the Parrot ironic and satirical, which gives us a genre, at least, in addition to children's literature. But what is the satire of is another question. But before we get to that, Selah, tell me some of your favorite parts of this weird little book.
I think some of my favorite parts is that really all throughout it you can see references to are women human, various things that are happening in the history of her, in the time period that she is. And so I like that in a really bizarre fairy tale or allegory, you can see connections to all of her other work. It's really fascinating.
You see it a lot. And this was, like I said, published in 1944. So her work is fairly developed at this point. Not all of it. Of course, Dante hadn't really made the scene, but that's our clock. That's our bird clock, just to give you an idea of place and time, if you knew what time it was. So, okay, so we're going to talk about themes that show up, but what's going on? Can you pick one story that you think you can tell the audience about, basically what it's saying? Who's Matilda? Who's Nurse Nature?
All right, so Matilda and Archibald, her brother,
are
younger brother, yes. So there's 2 children, which seems very typical for any fairy tale, right? It seems like a pretty
boy,
good
girl.
Exactly. Got the nurse, feels very Peter Pan setup. Like any classic fairy tale could take place starting off with this cast of characters.
Parents are off scene.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the first one about the canary, it's very hard to describe these, but there's a lot of discussion about how the canary like will sleep like in a blackout state, like because it has its wing over its head or whatever. And the children are talking about at the beginning of the story how a neighbor got in trouble, was fined because the blackout curtains fell off of their window like overnight. And so the bird is related to during the war having blackout curtains up in your room. And the conclusion is quite a jump, because the conclusion really at the end of the story is that you don't need oxygen, I believe is what she says. Oxygen.
Or fresh air.
Or fresh air in order to be able to sleep.
Because the bird does it, right?
Because the
tucks
bird.
his head under the wings, its wings. And I don't remember, like the mole maybe, or some other like
I believe they talk
animal
about rabbits and different creatures that live like in darkness underground.
Right.
And so since that's somehow a good thing, the animals do it, naturally that's better for us.
Right. So to sleep like a bird or a mole or something.
Or a rabbit. Or
as opposed to the opinions of Dr. Draft and Dr. Quickstep, who advocate like new hygiene or something. Doesn't one of them go to the School of Hygiene?
Yes. Dr. Draft, I believe, graduated from the School of New Hygiene.
And so the lesson is, and there's this lovely, this will give you kind of a tone here. There's this lovely, it's a satire. Sayers says it's a satire. And she has this great quote in there where it's a satire of Victorian literature.
Yes.
And Matilda is saying, I'm just going to read this from The Canary. Matilda is saying, young Matilda says, on the contrary, I sleep longer and more soundly, except, of course, when I am disturbed in the night by the siren. Of course, this is during World War II. The thick curtains make the room quite dark all the year round, in spite of British double summertime, which differs by 2 hours from Greenwich Mean Time and by 60 minutes from the old summertime we had before the war from April to September, and now we have 12 months in the year. That is quite right, dear Miss Matilda, interposed the nurse, but you should not make your informatory parentheses quite so long. You see, you are already breathless. That is a bad habit of mine, which I shall endeavor to correct, admitted Matilda. So that gives you an idea of
the children talk like very
children talk like
adults.
Professors.
Yes.
And are gently corrected like professors. Like
it's all very formal and not at all like how a child would actually speak.
Totally.
So it definitely makes you laugh.
Exactly. Which, again, we'll get into the satire bit in a little bit. So there's we won't go through every story, but that's the message of The Canary.
Of the first one, yes.
Right. Sleep without fresh air and in complete darkness, which I guess you could kind of see that. Another one, there's the cat. Let's talk about the beehive.
Yes, let's talk about the beehive.
Okay. So the beehive is young Archibald they're out in the country. Young Archibald is being a rambunctious young boy, and one of the keepers of the garden is showing him this beehive. And Archibald is very excited about it. He learns about how orderly it is, and it says a perfect society, and everybody has their job. And he's very excited. And he asks Matilda, he says something like, this is great. Like, I want our society to be like the bees society. Mm-hmm. And then one day he comes out and all of the drone workers of the bees are dead. And he's a little appalled. And what does Sayers, take it from there. Like, what does Sayers say about that? I'm going to look it up while you're talking.
So his nanny explains to him that in various animal societies, like I believe she gives the example of like the praying mantis as well as the bees. It's like, well, I mean, there's really no need for the men anymore. Like they're not needed. Like in the instance of lions or some other creature, they might be needed to like defend or protect the family. But in an ideal society, like the bees, etc., there's really no need for the males after they've helped, further the next generation.
So just like the bees, they all die or mostly die. Mm-hmm. Just enough are alive to keep. And Archibald is horrified at
right, because he thought this was the perfect society.
Right,
and
exactly.
Now it's not looking very good for him if it is.
Right, exactly. Like, and he's got to all of a sudden justify his existence as a boy. And then there's so many good quotes in here. And she's talking about men. and again, just remind you, this is satire. How deep the satire goes, I don't really know. Like, is it a satire on Victorian childhood? Is it childhood? Is it satire on the ideas presented? We'll get to Are Women Human here in a second. But, okay, so here's Archibald trying desperately to defend himself. He says, "That is true," said Archibald stoutly, "but it was the men who invented the machines." "And well they might," replied Nurse Nature, "for if they did not justify their existence by making some useful contribution to society, there would be a very good argument for condemning them to the fate of the drones." "All the same," interposed Matilda, "they are surely very short-sighted. For each new invention that economizes power and labor makes it easier for the women to step into their place. When they have invented everything needful for the easy functioning of society, they will have outlived their usefulness." And then he talks about, Archibald's like, "Well, what about war? Right? We need to fight wars." And then Nurse Nature says, "Well, how many wars would there be
without
the men?" And this is going to be our bridge to Are Women Human, because she says, Nurse Nature says, "Thus the men, perceiving the dangers to themselves of polygamy, have invoked religious sanctions against it," which is an interesting point. "They have also created a public opinion that debars females from participation in certain essential occupations, which they hope to keep to themselves. Thus they have endeavored, though not with uniform success, to forbid women access to the priesthood, the law, medicine, mercantile, marine, the arts and sciences, and various heavy industries, and have ousted them from the executive control even of such trades as were once deemed peculiarly feminine, such as brewing, baking, and distilling, spinning, weaving, and the making of jams, pickles, and preserves. And further, to discourage the participation of women in the trades and professions, they have arranged that such work as is allotted to them shall be of the most monotonous and disagreeable sort conceivable, and rewarded as a rate inferior to that which men receive." And then she goes on to talk about women in wartime and all of that. So tell us about Are Women Human a little bit, and how all this may connect.
In there about brewing, distilling, like weaving and carpentry. In Are Women Human, I think that exact list, or a lot of those same things, are in there, where she talks about how in like the Middle Ages and in previous time periods, those occupations were in the home. Like women were doing all of those things. And now there's been a shift in society where those things are no longer in the home, and it's just this.
It's like a factory setting.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
Right. And to be clear, like, Are Women Human? This is a series of essays that we've got another podcast on it called Are Women Human? But Sayers is talking about, she's writing in 1944. She's a woman who's a very successful career writer and has gotten there by her own steam. And she wears men's clothes because she likes pants, because she has two legs and all of that. But she's not against men. Like, I mean, right? Like in her other writings, like, it's not.
You don't get that impression, I don't think, from Are Women Human in the slightest.
No. And I don't think that's really her. Again, this is a question of how deep the satire goes. Like, this is not her usual way of writing. But she's a pretty sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek person.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think that part of satire is that you can't really see how deep it goes? Like, if it was clear-cut, would it still be a satire?
Oh, like here's the joke.
Right, exactly.
And, well, Lewis Carroll. I mean, Alice in Wonderland is a bit of satire, isn't it?
Yeah, and I feel like there are times reading that when I'm really not sure how deep it goes.
Right. So maybe that's fair. Maybe that's like she's poking fun at a lot. I mean, that's a work of a true comedian. Like, you can, well, I don't know about true, but like you can offend everybody.
Right. Yes.
Right. And Sayers like does a fabulous job, I think, offending possibly feminists who maybe go too far, offending men who have a certain ilk, who would think certain ways, and offending children's authors dating from the 1800s.
Yes.
She was available. Like, she's very happy to further doing that.
Or maybe even broader than just 1800s. It is specifically, I think, satire on that. But I feel like children's authors can be overly preachy, whatever the time period. And so I could see her also commenting
And
on
Sayers
that.
is dead against that,
Yes.
right? If you're going to do art, you do art because you want to portray the art, not because you're preaching through it. She's fine with preaching in preaching context.
Yes.
Right.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Lewis Carroll because she loved that book as a child. Like, that was very formative to her. She references it in this and Even the Parrot, as well as, like, I was just reading this essay in honor of Charles Williams the other day in which she referenced it. It's in tons of her letters, tons of her essays.
Mm-hmm.
She really liked Lewis Carroll.
And maybe this is her kind of nod to animals speaking. Well, animals don't actually speak. Like, she's not a fantasy writer, really. So animals aren't speaking even here. But like, it's the animal world
They're like
teaching us. They're personified, right? And it's not Lewis, it's not Narnia, it's and it's not Carol, because he's got animals speaking as well. But
Right,
it's
yes.
but this is kind of her nod to them. And there's this, maybe I shouldn't mention this, but like, there's this little family legend. I think it's in Katamari. I mentioned to you earlier about maybe like Lewis Carroll like looked into her pram when she was a baby or something. And there's some, you could do a whole other podcast probably on Lewis Carroll
for sure.
Okay, so we kind of, the beehive is just fascinating, but let's talk about the boa constrictor. Do you remember the boa constrictor? Like that, I can kind of give it a summary if you want me to, but it's...
So I believe they're being told a story. It's like an uncle who visits from overseas. You know, he comes and he tells them this really terrible story about a little boy who's been swallowed by a boa constrictor. And
yes, and you can see the bump.
You can see the bump on the boa constrictor.
Right. He's got a photo of it, and he shows it to Archibald and Matilda.
Yes.
And Uncle Peregrine, which is kind of a nice wandering name. This is allegory. Like, the names at least are allegorical. And so it's this, there's just like awareness. It's a boy who's been swallowed by a boa constrictor, and Sayers deals with it in a fairly ruthless fashion. Like, not entirely, but
I think almost entirely. It's completely like, there's no sense of sadness whatsoever.
No, it's like poor, he had he was in, where is it? India? I'm going to show my ignorance of she says, that is boa constrictor, one of the largest reptilian indigenous to the New World. And anyway, he's got, Uncle Peregrine has a favorite carrier. So I guess like a Sherpa or something. And the lump in the boa constrictor is named Chickweed. And he says that is, that Uncle Peregrine, with a touch of emotion in his voice, is poor Chickweed, the son of my favorite carrier, a well-grown lad of some 12 years of age. And they had found he was missing. And then they find him the next day.
Yeah.
And
so not only was it just a little boy, it was a little boy that he knew. And there's still zero.
There's still, like, he had a touch of emotion.
Impact.
And then they say he may have been teasing the boa constrictor. So, like, and true, like, I don't know where the sidewalk ends or further back, like true, like Grimm's brother, like he was teasing it, and so he got what.
What's that story? Godfrey Gordon, Gustavus Core. Like, he meets a horrible end for something.
You've heard the name before. Yeah. Yes, it's very
horrible end for something that seems minor, but a moral is still kind of pulled from it.
So the sub moral of the story is don't tease a boa constrictor. Like, that's kind of like part of it. But anyway, but the whole moral of the story is about dietary, like the dietary laws of nature. Right. And Archibald's like, nature says, nurse nature points out that, hey, in nature, you can eat when you want, for whatever you want, and for as long as you want, and stop when you're done. And Archibald says, hey, let's do that. Stop when
you're full.
Stop when you're full. Right. And then they start explaining, like, how could this work in society? And Archibald's like, maybe I wake up at 6:30 in the morning. Maybe I can eat then. And nurse nature says, well, who's going to fix your food? And so, like, she takes it to this other dietary, basically it's a statement like, dietary social laws are important, or no, I'm saying that wrong. How would you say it?
I almost felt like the moral in the story might be something like that. Dietary social laws are important, but I almost felt like she was poking fun at people who make dietary laws. Like, that's what stood out to me the most. It seems like these laws sound great, but they're not practical. Who's going to make you breakfast if you're up at 6 a.m? Right. Or something like that.
So, and that's the case. So that brings me to she has these epigrams at the very beginning of the book. And she has two different quotes. She says, let nature be your teacher, by Wordsworth. And then nature is usually wrong, by Whistler. So that's the message of the book. Let it be your teacher, and it's often wrong. And this would maybe fall under the often wrong or usually wrong category, right? Following nature's rules. Let's talk about the rabbit. We're going to leave the cat or family affection for another time, I think, if I have an episode on cats. But
you 100% should have an episode.
We should have an episode. That'd be fantastic.
Material.
The rabbit or town planning. Now, this is great because it is they're going to see a castle. They're off in the country,
Yes.
and there's a keeper of the castle. I don't remember his name. It's some appropriate castle keeper name.
It's a great setup. Very idyllic.
Yeah,
Seems
there's
like a great setup for a picnic.
Yeah, Mr. Ramrod. He's a keeper of the cat. Yeah, it's very idyllic. There, by the way, illustrations are by Silence, which I looked it up. He's a guy named William Augustus Silence, and
What an awesome name.
he's got a great name. And he used to work for Punch, and he did some advertisements and stuff like that.
Very cool.
Too. Yeah. So anyway, that's
Who the illustrator
who the
is.
illustrator
Very
is. Anyway, they're going to see this castle, and Mr. Ramrod is telling us about. He's talking to the kids about the nature of the castle. And do you remember about Matilda, like her interaction with it versus Archibald's interaction with it?
cool. Matilda is absolutely like enthralled by the castle, and she's asking all of these very intelligent questions about like medieval architecture and like
defense practices and stuff.
like the system of defense that was like typically present in castles from that era.
Mhm.
Whereas her brother is just sort of off frolicking, doing his own thing, can't really pay attention to anything the guide's saying, which is definitely interesting to consider, as Sayers was a medieval scholar.
Yep.
In a time where there were not a lot of women who were interested in that.
Right. And probably got a ton of flack about her interest in medieval defense,
Exactly.
that, that's men's work or something like that. And so, again, kind of a tangential, like, poke at what kind of the norms were. So there's that. That's a setup. And the title is The Rabbit or Town Planning. So while Archibald's off chasing these rabbits, they learn from. So Matilda like goes to the top, and there's this other girl like Angela Wishwell or something like Angel. Like there's this other friend with them, and I don't remember her name. But anyway, Matilda Angelina Wishwell is her name, and they're looking at the top from the castle, and she says, Matilda says, "Oh, look at all the ruined buildings." Because it's World War II, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think it's Wishwell. I don't confirm it. And so Angelina says, "Oh, won't it be great when they rebuild it? There'll be like glass structures, and there'll be, movie houses with great big windows," which doesn't make any sense, but like other buildings with great big windows. And they'll be just light and airy, and it'll be fun and beautiful and cheerful. And Matilda says, well, having just had this lecture from Mr. Ramrod on medieval defenses, she said, "I don't think that's such a good idea." And she says, maybe we should be, that's not very good for defense. Right. And so what does she conclude? What does she think should happen in the rebuilding of this town?
Well, first of all, she concludes that, the glass, all of that, like you said, terrible for defense. So therefore, got to reinvent, figure out some new system. And I believe they're watching the rabbit, like as her brother's chasing them or whatever, and they talk about how cheerful the rabbits are. And then she she ponders the rabbit and concludes that living underground would be the ideal defense, because this kind of harkens back a little bit to the canary, like living in darkness.
Sayers doesn't need a lot of oxygen, apparently.
But living underground is the best defense and would solve a lot of problems ultimately.
And everybody in the story is horrified by this. Well, maybe not Mr. Ramrod, but Archibald and Angelina are horrified by this. They're like, what? That's not very. We need air and windows and things like that. And Matilda's like, well, we have to think forwardly. We have to think about the next war. We can't think about peace. We have to think about war. And then we get beautiful gardens up top. Right? So even if they get blown to smithereens, that's okay. The humans can come back and
she's not against beauty for sure. There'll be beauty. It just will live underground.
And it's a very naturalist approach in a weird way. Like that we don't need to have all these ugly factories and stuff above ground. Put them below ground. And so talking about satire and things like that, I've got a letter excerpt here from Sayers' writing to a gentleman named Maurice Rickett. And this is, Even the Parrot is not well referenced. Like if you read in the biographies, is barely mentioned. Rafe Hones he mentions it like a little bit. There's a couple of articles on the internet about it that basically summarize, and you can actually learn a lot about wartime. If you're studying World War II, this is a good book as well. But it's not very well studied. And she's got this letter to Maurice Rickett about the rabbit. She doesn't say specifically the rabbit, but listen to this. She says, "People must stop shouting, 'No more war.' It's an absolutely certain way of jolly well getting a war. It only leads to the imposing of sanctions which no one has a moral courage to use except the immoral people. Put your factories underground. Put your 10-year supply of food underground. Disperse your populations and put that underground as far as possible. Announce loudly that you have a bigger bomb than anybody else, and if people like to start trouble, they're welcome. Incidentally, the putting of things underground would provide lots of nice, unprofitable employment for some time to come. It would also much improve the appearance of the country, which would be all garden cities. Only the city would be buried with a garden on top, immediately available by the nearest municipal lift. All the land could be cultivated. See my world-shaking book, Even the Parrot, to which nobody pays attention. So, am I reading this right? And that she's kind of saying, I mean, what do you think? That she's like actually advocating it? Because there are a couple of phrases in here that I think, well, maybe I'm not reading it quite right. Like, unprofitable employment.
Right. Well, on the surface, she's definitely advocating it.
Right.
I don't really know how seriously to take her on this, honestly.
Yeah, that's what you mentioned. Yeah.
Because I mean, there are, like we talked about earlier, like she will say things like, I don't like cats, and then later write like a bunch of poems about
she
cats.
names her cat, my cat Blitz sings her greetings and stuff like that, right?
Yes. So I'm not sure if she is being like satirical in this letter.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of it seem that she actually thinks it. Like it seems that maybe in World War II,
mm-hmm.
seems like you would probably spend some time in shelters and those would be valuable things
mm-hmm.
to have. And
mm-hmm.
so maybe it seems like, why not just
mm-hmm.
go all out and
go underground.
Which,
I mean, to be honest, like if you had seen the devastation, like if you had lived through the devastation of World War II, it would make sense.
Right.
If she was, in fact, advocating
mm-hmm.
that, which I don't, it'd be more research of underground advocation by Sayers on that. So I think we're about to wrap it up. So Selah, do you have any other thoughts about the book or Even the Parrot or themes that we missed on it?
I think we covered a lot of it. I think it's very much worth reading. And I think it's fascinating because there's just a ton of connections to her thought
mm-hmm.
and other things. And there's
mm-hmm.
a lot of stuff that you, like this quote from her, like, what does she actually think on this topic? So I just think it's very much worth considering.
I agree. And I think that here, let's have a look at the copy. Well, you can't see the copy, listeners, but this sadly is out of print. So we're advocating you're reading this book, but it actually is out of print. But you can get it. Like my copy is from overseas. It took a while, but it wasn't that expensive. It was like $20, $30 or something. So it wasn't that bad. But if you just actually look at the book, like if the illustration has a lady sitting on an armchair lecturing to responsible looking like young children, and this layers kind of looks like Sayers.
It does.
Right? Nurse Nature looks like Sayers.
She does.
And on the back of the book, it's a cool little tidbit here. It's an advertisement for the Bridgehead series,
mm-hmm.
which is it says a new series edited by Dorothy L. Sayers and Muriel St. Clair Byrne, already published The Mind of the Maker by Dorothy L. Sayers.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be incorrect, but Bridgehead series didn't really get off the ground. Like it was Mind of the Maker and maybe this other Masters of Reality, which they're
mm-hmm.
advertising. But so to hold in your hand, like a book that Sayers probably would have held.
Yeah. And
also that this is like the kind of advertisements it's very current to Sayers' life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a great little volume, and would definitely recommend reading it and looking at the illustrations by Silence and learning about the cat. But we'll deal with the cat in another episode. So Selah, we're going to sign off. So why don't you say goodbye?
Bye, everybody.
By the way, the piece I read at the beginning about the parrot is Sayers' opening statement to the volume, which she concludes in this way. I have lately begun to wonder whether my nurse was not in principle right, and my enlightened humanism wrong, however much in harmony with the spirit of my young age. Accordingly, I venture to present a few exemplary conversations in the traditional manner based upon my nurse's hypothesis that God has given wisdom to the animal creation. Thank you for joining us, and if you have any questions or comments, please email me, Lindsey Scholl, at DorothyLSayersPodcast@gmail.com. God bless you.